Hi there. I hope you're having a good week. Now, before we press on into the latter half of William's book, let's review. In this final full module of your course, our module thesis is, as we know, Bonhoeffer and Cohn demonstrate a mode of Christian empathy necessary for our own ecclesial experience. In order to clarify that thesis, in this video you'll perform two dense tasks. First, you'll analyze William's portrait of Abyssinian Baptist Church, the church that Bonhoeffer attended in Harlem, in terms of its ultimate effect on his former ethnocentric worldview. Second, and subsequently, you'll examine the ways in which, according to Williams, Bonhoeffer's experiences in Harlem prepared him to see clearly the threats posed to the church and to German society by Nazism. Let's press on, shall we? We left Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1930 and 31 with his readings in Cullen and Du Bois and others, formative literature that gradually changed his subtly racist theology into a more open and expansive theological framework. So William's thesis for his fourth chapter is pretty straightforward. He claims unabashedly that Bonhoeffer's experiences at Abyssinian Baptist reinforced what he learned from the Harlem Renaissance. Williams clarifies his thesis in three significant and succinct ways. First, Williams observes that being part of a black community changed Bonhoeffer's view on race. Williams here asserts that Bonhoeffer's first steps in racial reconciliation emerged from his experiences of teaching a Sunday school class at Abyssinian Baptist and visiting black homes as a member of that church. Williams argues that Bonhoeffer's mental grid, his appropriation of social experience, was utterly transformed by his experience at Abyssinian. We're just about to see how that's true. Next, Williams uses womanist, that is, black feminist, theologian Dolores Williams's four categories of race oppression in order to categorize Bonhoeffer's catalyzed consciousness. Please note, our author, Reggie Williams, has no distinct relation to Dolores Williams. Our author, Reggie Williams, itemizes the elder Williams categories as follows. Oppression in terms of race is manifest as a horizontal encounter, a vertical encounter, transformation of consciousness, and epistemological process. So for Bonhoeffer in Harlem, the horizontal encounter involved his relationships with black folks who had collectively experienced forms of abuse, like lynching. In the meantime, the vertical encounter, the African American experience of God, demonstrated for Bonhoeffer a deeply integrated faith born on the altar of suffering. Remember Williams' observation that Bonhoeffer discovered a newfound love of African American spirituals in the prior module. He reinforces that here. African American spirituals and hymnody testify to the black experience of racial oppression. When people singing spirituals are singing about heaven, it's not just a pie-in-the-sky ideal. The lyrics about heaven in Steal Away and Every Time I Feel the Spirit aren't just about eternal rest from pain. They're about the hope and the lived experience of freedom in the lives of African American folks. Now, Dolores Williams' third category is transformed consciousness, and for Bonhoeffer, that transformed consciousness was made manifest in the dialectical relationship that black folks in the States evinced towards white supremacist Christianity. Moreover, her fourth category is pedagogical process. Bonhoeffer's learning was broken open by his experience in Harlem, or so we're told by our author, the younger Williams. Reggie Williams asserts that learning in a situation of oppression is situational and localized. I agree, and folks like Brazilian educator Paulo Freire would certainly agree as well. The things that black folks learned in their situation in Harlem about life and about God differed greatly from the things that white folks like your professor would have learned in that same situation. And I believe that's still true today. Learning is conditioned by culture, so we can't guarantee that people are going to accept our form of knowledge because their form of knowledge may be different. Williams's second big idea in Chapter 4 is that black folks at Abyssinian Baptist, and in Harlem in general, experienced suffering because of the racist climate of the States, but that they came to embody both the priestly and prophetic aspects of the church because of their resistance to that racism. Citing Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, Williams claims that about 1 million black folks emigrated from the Deep South to Harlem between 1870 and 1930. About 165,000 of those black migrants were sought after as a surrogate labor force. Now, although the migrant families had great hope in their new situation, they were still exploited and made to live in unsafe spaces. Maybe you can resonate with that on some level. And Charles Powell Sr., the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist, entered that same matrix of social transformation. He sensed the significance of the Harlem Renaissance, and as pastor of Abyssinian, he gradually applied force to get his congregation to move its building directly into Harlem so they could be a greater part of that change. Furthermore, Powell disagreed with one Booker T. Washington and his stance on racism. Washington said that accommodation was possible, and Powell claimed that it was not. Some black folks wanted to ascend the social ladder and to join the middle class, so they learned to exercise power in the same way as white folks, but nonetheless, and here I quote Williams, even middle class and wealthy professional black people could not escape pejorative white social implications of their blackness, end quote. And while all that was going on, Williams observes the black church, with Abyssinian as a crucial example, was embodying a dialectical tension between its priestly and prophetic roles. Now, you may remember priestly and prophetic as two words that Frisk applies to Jesus back in Module 6. So, using Frisk's categories, the black church stood apart from its culture, naming and condemning racism, and then challenged the white culture, as prophets would do, to atone for that sin of racism through reconciliation. Williams also notes the dialectical tension in the black church between this world and the eschaton, the world to come, or the world as it should be. And in the third section of his fourth chapter, Williams asserts that Charles Powell Sr., Abyssinian's pastor when Bonhoeffer was in Harlem, was instrumental in bringing the social gospel into Harlem and changing his parishioners' lives. Powell was certainly appreciative of the power of reconciliation because Williams notes that Powell wanted black folks and white folks to get to know each other better. That said, Powell also believed strongly in his own people's agency. The pastor states in his own writings that black churches, in their priestly and prophetic roles, mediate the white racist churchly institutions. Powell believed fervently that Christian life is measured by engagement with the world, and that concrete loyalty to Christ is made manifest in the deeds that people do, in our behavior, in our actions. Williams channels Powell, asserting, and I quote, "A model church recognizes its responsibility to steward God's resources by meeting the concrete needs of its neighbors." In light of which, Powell put his money where his mouth was in December of 1930, at the beginning of the Great Depression, and used guilt as a motivator to force his fellow black pastors in Harlem, and probably New York generally, to act on their congregation's material poverty. And in light of Powell's tutelage, Williams contends, Bonhoeffer's Christian worldview was changed. Bonhoeffer began to realize both that the gospel must encompass all of life, and that the good news exists in one's present location and in God's actual work in the world. Now, that should do it for Williams' fourth chapter, and should lead us somewhat indirectly to our second big goal for this lecture. In terms of Williams' fifth chapter, you'll examine the ways in which, according to Williams, Bonhoeffer's experiences in Harlem prepared him to see and critique the threat posed to the church, and to German society by Nazism. As far as I can see, Williams' fifth chapter has three parts to it. First, Williams clarifies that in Harlem, Bonhoeffer's faith underwent an enormous development, because through the prophetic and priestly black church, Bonhoeffer had learned of the tradition that connects Jesus to suffering. In light of the fragile Weimar Republic, many Germans no longer believed in their country, and they needed their confidence restored. Unfortunately, they turned to National Socialism to get that shot in the arm, but Bonhoeffer couldn't do that. He knew that there was more significant aspects of this conflict than national confidence. In a letter that he wrote to his colleague Erwin Stutz, Bonhoeffer states, "Things do exist that are worth standing up for without compromise." Williams also observes that in pre-war Germany, as in America, white is normalized, and in fact in Germany is elevated to the status of the master race. At that time, not so much now. So the things on which one need not compromise are very evident in the second part of Williams' fifth chapter. Because of his radical and revelatory experiences in Harlem, Bonhoeffer's theology was charting a unique course distinct from others. For instance, in a Lutheran catechism that he authored with his friend and colleague Franz Hildebrand, a Jewish Lutheran pastor, Bonhoeffer asserted, and I quote, "God has arranged it so that all races of humanity come from one blood." End quote. In that place, we may see echoes of Dubois's credo, which we looked at briefly. And he's right, too. Throughout Scripture, we return to the unity of the human family. Abraham and Sarah were Aramaeans, Babylonians actually, chosen by God to bless all the nations of the world. Meanwhile, Rahab is a native of Jericho who helps the nascent Hebrew nation. Ruth, a Moabite widow, is the great-grandmother of David, the best of the kings of Israel, and Jesus, the direct descendant of all those people, according to Matthew, is always standing by the outsider and finding ways to include those on the outside of what Kathy Black calls social purity codes. Bonhoeffer was ordained as a Lutheran pastor in November of '31 and immediately began a chaplaincy and lectureship position at the Humboldt University of Berlin, then called Friedrich Wilhelm. Unfortunately, Bonhoeffer was uncomfortable in that position because he found that his model of chaplaincy was too socially challenging for his students who sympathized with the Nazis. By contrast, Bonhoeffer taught a raucous class of students at the Charlottenburg Youth Club in East Berlin. In that position, he was allowed to do outreach with working-class young folks. And then when he didn't get a pastorate in the slums of Berlin in 1933, Bonhoeffer gave a series of Christology lectures, where he made clear that Jesus stood and still stands with working-class folks against those who love capitalism. Which should lead us all quickly to the third and final part of Williams' last chapter. Bonhoeffer's theology, with its Jesus-out-of-the-box approach, was in an antithetical tension with the Vogtind theology of much of the German church. Other German pastors, unlike Bonhoeffer, did not see race as a problem that the church needed to address. Bonhoeffer did see that, and because of his prophetic faith, shaped by the Black Church in Harlem, Bonhoeffer formed the Confessing Church, an ecclesial instrument of the resistance, a state church that opposed Nazism. That church rejected the Aryan paragraph that restricted the rights of Jews, Poles, Slavs, and other non-Aryan peoples within Germany. And they did that because the National Socialist blend of nation, race, and religion was lethal, Williams's word. Williams's last points mostly focus on Bonhoeffer's view of Christ in light of his experiences in Harlem. As the one who is for us, or pro nobis, Christ suffers on the cross as our representative. Moreover, Bonhoeffer states that life is not a thing, an essence, or a concept. Christ is life. Indeed, Christ's identity with suffering becomes the hiddenness of God's glory, according to Bonhoeffer, and to Williams too. And even though, in light of that paradigm of Christ, a paradigm with which Quoke and others would certainly agree, Bonhoeffer's view of race isolated him in his native Germany. Even though that was the case, the pro-social elements of his theology empowered him to take an active stance against Nazism for the remainder of his life, up until the day he died in Flossenburg in April 1945. So that's a good place to stop and recap for a moment. Our module thesis this time has been Bonhoeffer and Cohn demonstrate a mode of Christian empathy necessary for our own ecclesial experience. In order to clarify that thesis, in this video you've performed two tasks. First, you've analyzed Williams's portrait of Abyssinian Baptist Church, the church that Bonhoeffer attended in Harlem, in terms of its ultimate effects upon his former ethnocentric worldview. Second, you've examined the ways in which, according to Williams, Bonhoeffer's experiences in Harlem prepared him to see clearly the threat posed to the church and to German society by Nazism after his time in the States. And that second part ended just now, with Williams meditating on Bonhoeffer's view of Jesus. That's enough for the moment. When you're ready, please go on to the next and penultimate video. Thank you.